Alhamdulillah wahdu wa salatu wa salam ala man la nabiyya ba'dahu. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu. It's an honor to be with all of you. And my last name is Wright, not Knight. Knight is the last name of my wife, so I'm happy to be confused with her, with the honor of having be named by her last name. In any case, I really am happy with, very, very proud to be on this platform with Hamid Foundation. I believe I was scheduled to come visit you all my last trip to London, and then I was never able to due to the short period of time when I was there, and then COVID happened. I haven't been able to return, but I'm also very honored to have been invited first by Babar Siddiqui, who is doing such great work in London, and also to be introduced by my dear friend also, Shaykh Ahmed so yeah, even though I can't be with you there in person, again, this is not the ideal world, of course. Our tradition teaches us that it's very important to be, together with people in a person-to-person companionship in order to fully understand how knowledge is meant to be personified and to make an entire being, not just the hologram that you see on your screen. So this conversation that I thought to have with you today, and again, I'll try to keep my comments short. I know it's late for many of us, and then just be available to answer any questions you have. Is I'm invoking this question of epistemology, and I'm sorry to sound like an academic. It's not really it's just a fancy word to talk about a methodology of knowing something, right? So of course, in this case, our object that we want to know is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one God. And why is this important to think about what Al Ghazali often refers to as the tripartite epistemological method, essentially? Because oftentimes when we think about this, we invoke the question of Sufi gnosis, or getting to know Allah, maʿrifatillah, the knowledge of the science of knowing God and the extinction of the self. Oftentimes we're immediately relegated to a field of, anti-rational and I would say, perhaps overly mystical, I guess would be the word, but ways in which it's sort of discounted from, I guess, a scientific inquiry. So when the Ahl Tasawwuf, the people of Tasawwuf, when they talk about maʿrifa, they often use the word, ilm al-maʿrifa, meaning the science of gnosis or the science of cognizance. And what they mean by the invocation of science here is that it's a methodology that can be replicated, right? Now, there's certainly, Al Ghazali will say things like, when he gets talking about maʿrifa too much, he'll say this is the place where the pens snap and the hands are withdrawn, or when it's better to be quiet. And so there's clearly an indication that this is not a knowledge that can be gained through awraq, right, or sheets of paper, but rather through azwaq, rather through spiritual experience, or literally tasting. But that doesn't mean that it's so. Despite that, it needs to be experienced and taught from a person who knows the science in question, and I'll explain how Ghazali makes that case, although very subtly. It's still something that has specific procedures, and is not something that people are sort of imagining. So I guess that's what's at stake here, is that oftentimes when we talk about this type of knowledge and its incumbency and its importance for all human beings to obtain, it's often thought to be, it's something that, since it can't be sort of thought about rationally, we have to sort of move beyond our rational minds, and therefore it's something that is a product of imagination, right? People can accuse us of thinking about of just being imagining this type of a knowledge. And so this is not, when we talk about this tripartite epistemology, or the three different types of ways of knowing, we're not sort of dividing the human condition into two, right? We're not just saying, well, we have the mystics on one hand and the scientists on the other, and never the two shall meet, right? And so, and that if we want to embark on the Sufi path, we have to be sort of anti-scholastic or anti-intellectual. That was certainly not the case for Al Ghazali, although, you know, in some spheres he is accused of sort of undermining Hellenistic philosophy. That case has really been exaggerated. In fact, he confirms the use of many of the types of knowledge that the Hellenistic philosophers were engaged in, including mathematics, including physics. So he recognizes that there is a place for rational inquiry, right? But he wants to say that the rational mind, disjointed from a revelatory text, cannot really understand things that, you know, because rational knowledge is one thing built upon another. They have a difficulty understanding things that we know through revelation, such as, you know, the day of judgment or the resurrection of bodies. So these things are not possible for the rational mind to understand. But nonetheless, so he wants to restrict the activity of the rational mind away from the sphere of metaphysics, right? And basically to say that this is a type of hubris, a type of a sort of misplaced pride, to think that a rational mind disconnected from revelation can actually know the unseen realities. But he does make a case that, on the other hand, right, is that if you dismiss the sound findings of science and in mathematics, in the name of religion, saying that he said, you don't do anything except besmirch the name of religion. You don't tarnish the name of science, right? So this was the idea then, that there were these spheres. And I think for Al Ghazali, what he's basically saying is that, you know, there are different levels of understanding that people go through. And there is and so this type of spiritual unveiling, which he calls kashf, which literally means the raising of the veil, kashf al-hijab, you see, right? Or the unveiling of spiritual realities. That this is a knowledge a person will have got to this after they've already gone through the stages of, you know, rational speculation, and before that, the knowledge of truth by transmission, ilm al-naql. So in other words, there's sort of like a smaller, you know, a sphere of a type of knowledge that you get through transmission, right? The most basic is when you start growing up, your parents tell you certain things and you obey, right? So that's a type of knowledge. Now, bigger than that, then is a type of knowledge that's through rational abstract speculation, right? So in the beginning, you know, ilm al-naql is also by, you know, the experience of your five senses. In other words, your five senses will bring you information that you now know is reliable, right? So if you touch fire, you find that it's hot, and you don't touch fire again, right? That's a type of a knowledge that you get through instinct, or the transmission of your five senses. But later on, you'll find out that, okay, I can know not to touch the radiator because there's a fire that has heated up the water, which has heated up the metal, and therefore the metal will be hot. Well, you don't understand that except through, you know, rational conjecture or abstract reasoning. But that's a type of a knowledge that a person, you know, so basically he says these are three types of knowledge. In the beginning, if you tell the child, don't touch the radiator, he's not going to know what you're talking about, right? And he's going to touch it, and he's going to get burned, right? And he says he's going to reject your understanding that you're bringing to him of rational rational inquiry, simply because his mind is not prepared to sort of understand that yet, right? And similarly, he says, as a person who's got to the sphere of, of reason, there's a sphere above that too, right, called kashf. And the person of reason cannot understand the experiences and the knowledge gained through kashf. And so they reject it, but they reject it simply because it's a type of a knowledge or a type of understanding that they themselves have not yet reached, right? So this is why I think Al Ghazali's epistemological framework is so important, because he lets you understand that these are sort of gradual experience or gradual frameworks, ways of seeing the world that all of us pass through, right? But he allows you to see that there's a type of knowledge, a type of certainty that you can have of the unseen world that's beyond knowledge by transmission, is beyond knowledge by rational confirmation, and so this is a knowledge of certainty gained through spiritual unveiling, right? So Al Ghazali, for example, will specifically reference the category of wahi, right? So this is a category of divine inspiration, and the majority understanding, of course, is that wahi is a broader category, of which tanzil is an exceptional category, right? So tanzil, meaning revelation, is certainly specific to prophets, but wahi, meaning divine inspiration, is something that the ordinary believer can have. And for Al Ghazali, he means to say this is a way in which you can actually understand how prophecy works, right? You have an innate ability to sort of make confirmation, to make tahqiq or verification of what happens, or the kind of experience of revelation, even though you yourself are not receiving revelation, right? And so he will point to this hadith where the Prophet says that the dream of the true believer is 146 parts of prophecy. Okay? So this is something that there are procedures for Al Ghazali to increase your ability to experience spiritual unveilings, but this is something that's in some ways inescapable. It's part of the fitra, right? It's part of the natural disposition of all human beings to have this propensity to witness the unseen world, right? Okay, so this is a brief introduction to why this is an important conversation, and then I wanted to talk very briefly about Al Ghazali's methodology, and then I will basically think about some of the ways. So Al Ghazali dies in 1111 of the Common Era. I'm going to sort of vault forward 700 years to Shaykh Ahmed Al Tijani. So between Khurasan, Baghdad, and North Africa, and I hope you don't get vertigo from this kind of transposition. But I basically want to suggest that this has been Shaykh Ahmed Al Tijani as one example, that this has been a global conversation that has transfixed, or has really occupied the minds of later intellectuals like Shaykh Ahmed Al Tijani. And so I will kind of think about with you some of the ways in which this very prominent North African Shaykh makes certain qualifications or further explanation of the schema laid out by Imam Al Ghazali. All right, so the way that I guess the text that I would be relying on primarily is Kitab Ja'ab al-Qalb, which is one of the book of the marvels of the heart, which is one of the many books of the Ihya al-Ulumuddin, the revival of the religious sciences. So in this book, it's not the only place that he does so. Al Ghazali lays out this very interesting schema, and he says, okay, say for example, he's talking about types of learning, types of ways of knowing something. So he says, say for example, there is a man named Zaid. He lives in a house, and you want to get to know who is this Zaid. Well, the first way you can get to know about Zaid is that you um, hear the reports of people who have seen Zaid, right? And you accept them, right? And from those reports, you can understand certain things about Zaid by these transmissions, right? But he said the wise person will understand, of course, that these transmissions are not 100% reliable, right? That the transmissions themselves can be um, uh, are in need of verification, right? And so he said, this is the same. If we accept that Islam is the truth simply because our parents told us that Islam is the truth, then how do we compare ourselves to Christians who accept Christianity simply because their parents told them that Christianity was the truth, right? There has to be a way of ascertaining the ultimate the truth of the prophet's message, aside from us accepting what our parents told us, right? Um, so, um, so he says the next thing to do is to go closer to the house that Zayd lives in, right? And now you're gonna sit at the door of the house, and you're gonna observe what you see, and you're going to compare what your observations to the transmitted reports that you have received, right? He says, so this can help you, and this is this. So the first sphere is that of naql, or of transmission. The second sphere here is of aql, or of rational reflection. And this can help you verify the transmitted reports you've received, because you hear the voice of Zayd coming out of the house, right? You see the people coming in and out of the house, what they're bringing to Zayd, what they come out with, right? And so this can actually, help you to have further faith in the transmitted reports that you've received. But he said the wise person will also understand that this type of knowledge is not free from error either, right? In other words, somebody could be people could be going into the house to see somebody else, right? There could be somebody in the house pretending to be Zayd. In any case, you don't know what Zayd's voice actually sounds like. You've never actually looked on Zayd, right? And so the last and only type of knowledge that's free from error, although he admits that there are different ways of actually witnessing, right, is to go into the house and look upon Zayd directly. Right. So for him, this is the experience of maʿrifa, right? Of the direct witnessing of the divine presence, and which helps you to verify your faith in a way that is above and beyond the verification of your faith through rational exploration, or the verification of your faith through transmitted reports. Okay? So by way of ishara, I think you can also compare this to the Maqamadin al-Thalath, the three steps, three stations of the religion, right? We can understand that between Islam, Iman, and Ihsan, or submission, faith, and spiritual excellence, that the first methodology, the methodology for knowing how to practice Islam, is by transmitted reports, right? We don't say we received that we're supposed to pray 5 prayers, and we don't use our minds to say, well, 6 is better than 5, so let's make it obligatory to pray 6 times a day instead of 5, right? No, that's so we confirm the basis of our ibadah based upon these transmitted reports. So I also want to make clear that Al Ghazali is not dismissive. It can come across the way that I presented it, that he's sort of dismissive of these other categories. He's in fact not, right? And he's also recognizing that some people, if their religious faith is sound, and it has no no doubt in it at the level of accepting transmitted reports, then it's okay for that person to stay there, right? So he's sort of walking you through what happened to himself, which was that he went through stages of successive questioning, right? where he questions, well, how is it that, as I said, this basic question, how is it that I know that Islam is the truth simply because I was born into it? Aren't other religious practitioners also thinking that their religion is the truth based upon the fact that they were born into those religions? So these now, the use of the reason for him is very important to understand that there are ways of sort of verifying, there are logical explanations for the truth of tawhid, for example, that there was only one God, right? Or that there is a creator God in the first place, right? And so this is the field of theology, which is certainly based upon the intellect, right? And this is something that the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the Ash'ari tradition firmly recognizes, right? That we have to make use of our intellect in some cases, and of course, there's a difference between what is fard ayn and what is fard kifaya. And Shaykh Ahmed Tijani says, really, the proof of Allah, or the contract between Allah and his creation, is simply what has come with the messengers, right? So it's not as if intense rational speculation is necessary for the person to verify their faith. But in some cases, theological delving into the intricacies of free will and predestination, for example, is the Quran created, is it uncreated? In other words, what is the relationship between Allah's essence to his attributes? These are things that somebody needs to be able to explain logically, rationally speaking, right? This is fard kifaya, meaning if one person does it, it lifts the obligation for others to do it. So this is so he says, if you're, if this is good for you, but if you're coming to a stage where you're starting to question, how is it that I know Islam to be true, right? How is it that I know that there is a God, right? So you can go through successive, or you can explore alternative epistemologies, in other words, for you to verify your faith. And this is something that Al Ghazali does himself, right? He's at first a great Shafi jurist, then he's the world's most accomplished theologian at his time, and then he leaves that also to spend 10 years pursuing the Sufi path to get direct firsthand experience or witnessing the divine presence, right? Which for him now verifies his faith in a way that was not, he was not satisfied with transmission or with rational inquiry. All right, but the truth is that Al Ghazali, when he gets to talking about maʿrifa, when he gets to talking about kashf, as I said, he doesn't talk about it much, right? He basically indicates to you that this is there, this is something that you can and should experience, but he recognizes that it's not something that I can communicate to you through words on a page. But rather, he's interested in the methodology by which, sort of pointing out to you the logical necessity or the logical acceptability of this epistemology, this type of learning, right? And so the way that he does that is this intense discussion that he embarks upon, talking about the heart, right? And it's largely with Al Ghazali that many of these hadith that get popularized for the later Sufi tradition, largely with Al Ghazali, that we find these hadiths sort of collected, right? And you're probably aware of all of them. Hadith Qudsi, where God says, I who cannot fit into universes upon universes fit into the heart of the sincere believer. And so for Al Ghazali, then, the heart is this place where the witnessing of God takes place, right? And he likens the heart to a mirror, right? So if I could find I'll just read you a relevant quote. He says, every heart is naturally disposed to experiential knowledge of spiritual realities, for it is a divine exalted charge that distinguishes humankind from all other elements in the universe through this uniqueness and nobility. The word of God alludes to this. We did offer the trust of the heavens and the earth and the mountains, but they declined to bear it, for they feared it, but the human being undertook it. This is Surah Al-Ahzab. This indicates that human beings possess a unique characteristic that distinguishes them from the heavens and the earth and the mountains, that renders them capable of undertaking the trust of God. And this trust is experiential knowledge, an acknowledgement of the divine transcendent unity. And the heart of every human being is prepared for undertaking the trust and inherently capable of it. However, the conditions I have been discussing, I'll just allude to those in a second, impede it from assuming its burdens and attaining the full realization of it. It was on this account that Muhammad ﷺ said, everyone begotten is born with a natural inclination, though his parents make him a Jew or a Christian or a Magian. In the words of God's messenger, if the devils did not swarm about the hearts of the children of Adam, they would look toward the kingdom of heavens. These words are alluding to one of the conditions that stand as a veil between human hearts and the kingdom of heaven. And he relates this other narration where Ibn Umar, the son of Umar, asked the Prophet, says, "O Messenger of God, where is God, in heaven or on earth or in heaven?" And he replied, he is in the hearts of his faithful servants. So for Al Ghazali, then he says, okay, this is the heart then that explains the unique capacity of human beings, right? To witness the divine presence, to know God, right? And of course, when in the Quran, in Surah Al-Rahman, when God says, I have not created the jinns and the human beings to worship me, Ibn Abbas says, who is the great Mufassir, prayed for by the Prophet, he says, فَيَعْبُدُونَ مَعْنَهَا يَعْرَفُونَ, right? To worship me in this case means to know me, right? So for Al Ghazali, then this is the organ in the human being which allows that person to know God, and this heart has been endowed with the capacity. Every human heart is endowed with the capacity to reflect the divine presence. So then he wants to ask, well, how is it that most human hearts are veiled from this knowledge, right? And for that, he gives basically 5 reasons, right? So the first reason for him is that the heart is simply not ready, right? That there's some sort of deficiency in that heart, right? He said that deficiency could be for a variety of reasons. It could be that the person is just not old enough yet, right? And so it's not necessary, their heart is going to be inclined towards other things naturally in those periods of their development, and so no need to talk to them about maʿrifa at that point. He said the second reason that the heart can be veiled is that sins have tarnished it, right? And of course, this is a reality spoken to by the hadith also, right? So sins, in other words, that you don't repent from. Any sin that you don't repent from, according to Al Ghazali, also quoting a hadith, now leaves a stain on the heart, right? Thirdly, the heart could be turned away from God, right? In other words, the heart is a mirror. In order to reflect the light, you have to turn it towards the light. If it's turned away to something else, it's not going to reflect the light. It could be a clean mirror, right? It could be a mature mirror. It could be a stainless mirror, but or free of sin, in other words, but it's directed towards something else, right? So he said, this is how we think about the type of distractions that most of us are involved in, what we're thinking about. When we're obsessed with whatever social media presence or whatever else, our hearts are now turned in that direction and not turned towards God, right? And the fourth reason and I'm basically giving my own characterizations of what he's saying here, but I would describe it as excessive doctrinism, right? In other words, you could be so affixed to a theological principle of whether you can see God or not, for example, whether God is present in knowledge or in essence. Um, uh, is his transcendence becoming of you able to experience him in this life or only after death, right? So these are types of ideological loopholes that people get stuck into, right? And they don't allow them to see the thing that their hearts are actually reflecting, right? Um, and I think most people who teach the maʿrifa, right, who give tarbiyah, the process of spiritual training, in other words, control of your nafs, of your ego self, so that you can have the knowledge of God. We'll also recognize that excessive concern for the words of the Sufis can also be one of these doctrinal obsessions, right? Why? Because you start imagining how the knowledge or the experience of God will come to you, and so you're in a way fetishizing, right? Or you're creating a certain image of what that knowledge has to be like, or that experience has to be like. So if it comes to you in another way, you don't recognize it, right? You're not open. And so this is a veil then on your heart, right? You want to experience God, the love of God, the way Rumi talks about it, right? But maybe the love of God, you'll experience it in another way, right? And so the last way for Al Ghazali that your heart could be veiled is that you're actually ignorant of the, and here again, I'm sort of paraphrasing, you're ignorant of the methods of keeping the heart orientated towards God, keeping this mirror orientated towards the light, right? And so, for example, you could be misunderstanding, you may have a reflection of the light, but then if you need to find the light around a corner, for example, you need to know now how to position a subsidiary mirror or a second mirror by which you can see the light reflected around the corner. I think here is where he's really, I think not so subtly, indicating the importance of having a teacher, right? Somebody who knows the methodology of keeping your heart orientated on God, right? All right. Well, I've been talking for a while already. So, but I just wanted to kind of suggest here that Al Ghazali is walking you through these different types of epistemologies to kind of return you to the heart. So you have this interesting example now or interesting metaphor where the person who is coming in to look at Zaid, right, is actually having to go back and look at himself, right? Because he has to now make sure that how is he seeing Zaid? And Ghazali does have a discussion here that the actual witnessing of the divine presence, even if you have the aspiration to get there and have walked through the door, that sometimes you're not going to be able to see God the way that, or witness the divine presence and arrive at this certainty as you should. And these are the reasons for that, right? So what does Shaykh Ahmed Tijani say about these things? Well, first of all, I will basically talk about the importance of maʿrifa for the Tijani tradition, and I guess to basically point out that although Al Ghazali doesn't explore maʿrifa through texts, the later tradition with Ibn Arabi, Ibn Farid, and certainly into the 18th century with Sufi sheikhs like Shaykh Ahmed Tijani and the inheriting Khurafa in the Tijaniya, very explicitly do talk about the importance of knowing God. Of course, they're also consistent with Al Ghazali, and they say that we're not trying to actually transmit knowledge through the text. But as people become further and further distant from even recognizing that this is a truth that they should be seeking, it is important to remind them of how beautiful it is to know God and how important it is to know God, right? This is why Shaykh Rahman Yas from Senegal, he says, whoever does not obtain the knowledge of the most merciful, his life has been in ruin for all time spent, right? And he says, wherever there is a hijab between you and God, whatever there is a veil between you and فذلك نوع من العقاب, right? مهما كان الحجاب فذلك نوع من العقاب. Wherever there is a veil, there's a type of punishment, right? Because there's a type of separation between you and God. So you should be continuously trying to polish the mirror of your heart, right? What does Shaykh Ahmed Tijani say about this? So I'm going to just find a relevant quote where Shaykh Ahmed Tijani talks about this natural condition of the human being to know God in a similar way that Al Ghazali talks about it. Remember, Al Ghazali spoke about how every human being has a heart that's capable of knowing God, right? This is what Shaykh Ahmed Tijani says about that. He says, all of the worlds are included in the divine love, even the disbelievers, the kuffar. For they are his beloveds in the presence of his words. I love to be known, this is Hadith Qudsi, so I created the creation and made myself known to them, and by me they know me. Do not imagine, Shaykh Ahmed Tijani says, that any in creation are excluded from this maʿrifa, this cognizance. Indeed, all of the souls, the arwah, have been created with complete cognizance of God the Exalted. Ignorance only occurred to them with their mixture in the material body. So the ignorance that befell the souls or the awrah, the spirits, is not intrinsic to them. Knowledge of God the Exalted is that which is intrinsic to them. So what Shaykh Ahmed Tijani is basically reminding us here is that polishing of the heart is actually a polishing that takes place so that the knowledge that's already in the human soul, in the human spirit, the ruh, can be reflected in the heart, right? So in other words, this is the knowledge of God is not external to you, right? You have that knowledge already in your human spirit. And the necessity of cleaning your heart to see it is so that light that's already in your human spirit can be now reflected in your heart, right? And so in another place, Shaykh Ahmed Tijani says that sometimes people who are not used to this experience, they actually confuse the mirror with the manifestation, right? So he says those of weak illumination, meaning when they're just starting to experience fath, like they're just starting to see the light of God in their heart, right? See the manifestation shining in the mirror, right? Meaning mirror of their heart, and see nothing else, meaning other than the real. Such a person, due to the weakness of his illumination, says all of the creation is God and there is nothing else in it. But who has his illumination strengthened, witnesses both the mirror and the manifestation therein, and he gives every degree, whether divine or created, its right. One does not veil him from the other. Okay, so in other words, he's not, and this is, so he's basically pointing to how it is that a person like Al-Halaj will get to a point where he says, "An al-Haq," right? I am the truth. I am the real. I am God, right? Because he's just started to, and this is why his teacher, Imam Al said, no, he hasn't really fully actualized his maʿrifa, right? Or his cognizance. And so he has to be able to come down to a place where he knows that, the transcendent being, right? That he is not, his heart is reflecting the transcendent being, but it's not the transcendent being itself, right? I think I will stop there. I think I've been speaking for a while, but I'm basically making the point here that this this epistemology laid out by Al Ghazali is a very fruitful and fertile framework by which the Sufi tradition is really, thinking and exploring these topics of the direct witnessing of God as a scientific method, right, that can be replicated. And there's indeed a remarkable continuity in the descriptions of the witnessing of the divine presence, whether you go from West Africa or whether you go from India. And I will just end with a statement about what this experience means from the statement of Shaykh Ahmad in his magnum opus, the Kashf al-Libas. He says, know that when a servant comes near to Allah through supererogatory good works, nawafil, God enraptures him, loving him with a forceful attraction. In this rapture, the servant is not aware of himself or anything else, neither what came before, nor what will come after, neither any part of himself nor the whole of himself. He becomes absent from his personal witnessing and is consumed in the intensity of his master's summoning. Glorious and exalted is he. In this state, he witnesses the divine presence as before the world and after the hereafter, as before the before and after the after. This presence has no beginning and no end, no above and no below, no right and no left, no explanation and no definition, no name and no attribute, no going forward and no going back, no connection and no separation, no going in and no going out, no sensation and no realization, no incarnation and no fusion. The lover becomes extinct in his beloved, and he becomes extinct to his own extinction. Nothing remains except the divine selfhood. Right. So this is an experience of basically Shaykh Ibrahim is saying, okay, I'm not going to teach you what maʿrifa is, right? But in other places, when he gives speeches, he will say, when he makes reference to maʿrifa, he'll say, those who've already experienced will know what I'm talking about. But at least what he's doing fundamentally is to awaken this human longing, right? I think it's very difficult for any human being to hear these words of incredible, rapture and love and annihilation of the self in the divine presence and not be affected, right? It speaks to something in the human condition. And the fact that Shaykh Ibrahim is sort of making this very clear, this great Tijani Sheikh from Senegal, is, I think, speaking to the fact that people are sort of forgetting, right? During Al Ghazali's time, the incumbency of maʿrifa, or the discourse around cognizance, was well established, right? People thought about knowing God, and they devoted their lives, right, to knowing God. They had other types of historical crises, sure, but this time, the 20th century, 21st century, of incredibly increased distraction, I think is what motivates Shaykh Ibrahim really to sort of make these very explicit descriptions of what is the knowledge of God and why it's necessary, right? To sort of remind the human condition, remind any type of human being that this is what you were created for, right? Okay, so I just wanted to point out that this was an important epistemology, that this is something that when we talk about religious identity, when we talk about the Deen al-Islam, we're talking about it all comprehensive stages of development that we have to keep progressing, right? It's not enough to sort of, I mean, if you are comfortable wherever you're comfortable, fine. But if you're having a longing to know more, to actualize your religious identity with increasing layers of sincerity and certainty, then there is a very specific procedure by which that can be obtained, right? I was teaching a graduate course here in Qatar, and a Qatari man, he raised his hand and he said, I was born a Muslim, but I think I'm a I think I'm a kafir. I think I'm an atheist. And I said, that's, I'm playing a sort of academic role. So I said, well, that's very interesting. How is it that why is it that you're saying that? He said, well, I don't know how it is. I'm seeing that I was raised to believe in Islam, but I see that there are other people that are raised to believe in the truth of various other religions. And how is it that I know I can't have any confidence that the things that I've been taught are actually true? And I said, well, that's a very good question, right? But that's not a reason to call yourself an atheist. Some of the greatest scholars of Islam, like Imam Al Ghazali, asked the same questions, right? And this is the procedures by which they answered those questions. And so I think it's, all of us that are, raising children also, right? Your children will start to ask you very inquisitive questions. And I think it's an easy way out to say, well, don't, we kind of have this knee-jerk reaction where we present the religion as very kind of, I don't feel like talking about this, right? Or you can't understand this yet, right? Or I'll talk to you later about this, right? But in fact, the asking of the question, even if it comes across in a way where you think, well, maybe it's my child, doubting the religion. What we have to understand is the asking of the question itself is part of getting the answer. If you don't ask the question, you're not going to know to look for the answer, right? And I think the vibrancy of our intellectual tradition as Muslims is that it provides an incredible diversity of epistemological perspectives, right? We can have whole conversations all day and all night for years about the importance of transmitted knowledge and how we verify various reports, right? That's a legitimate inquiry. We can talk about theology and what is the place of reason and verifying how we can make a case for the existence of a creator God based upon our own minds, right? And people have spent their whole lives doing that, right? We can also talk about the direct spiritual witnessing. And I think, what's important, if you look at the actual, I think the Orthodox tradition, and by that I would say, the four schools of the fiqh, the Ashri or the Maturidi schools, maybe some others that have been recognized as Orthodox. And then the Junaidi Sufism, right? This type of Sufism that's fully consistent with the Sharia law, which is all of the types of Sufism, Imam Al Ghazali, Shaykh Ahmad that we're talking about right now. That these were all traditions that never saw themselves as mutually exclusive, right? They were mutually supportive. And so that's the basic argument of the book that I just wrote called Realizing Islam, which is that if you want to understand what scholars were doing in this tradition, you have to understand these mutually supportive disciplines of intellectual inquiry that did include Islamic law, that did include theology, that did include direct witnessing of the divine, right? And so some of the greatest scholars that are talking about experiencing God are also some of the greatest scholars of jurisprudence, some of the greatest scholars of theology. Fair enough? Okay. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer.
Assalamu alaikum, Ustaz Zakariya. Thank you so much for really making this topic relatable to a lot of people. So we've had some comments saying how much they appreciate that. One of the questions is that, in modern society, we're conditioned in a way in terms of knowledge to look at things which are tangible or things which are really boxed, not to really think, abstractly, or to think, or relate to things in an experiential way, with the exception of a few areas, like, I don't know, like psychotherapy or something, where there's those components. And so here we're inviting people to consider the experiential. And so there's like a big gap. And so for a lot of people, it's, how do you bridge that gap between how we are conditioned into thinking and relating to things in life, and how can we, get closer to the experiential?
Right. I think that's a very good question. What it reminds me of essentially is reading, for me, reading Soren Kierkegaard for the first time, you know, and as kind of going through colleges before I converted to Islam, sort of a person questioning that, was there a God, and if so, was religion essential, you know. And basically what Kierkegaard points out is that this gnawing need to know God, to have faith in the unseen, is not a comfortable phenomenon, right? It's not something that gives us comfort, right? It's something that keeps us up at night. It's something that forces us to take risks, right? And so for Kierkegaard, he's basically saying that this leap of faith into the unknown is what makes us humans, right? And I think this is essentially Al Ghazali's example. And hopefully Al Ghazali did this so that we don't have to do it, right? But he has like the best, I mean, as an academic, right? He's the best, he's like the chair of I don't know, the best field at Harvard University of his time, right? He's well paid, he's well respected. People are coming from all over the world to study with him. And all of a sudden he leaves, right? He leaves all of that to be an unknown wandering dervish in order to get certain knowledge, right? That's not a comfortable thing for him to do, right? And so yes, we're conditioned to sort of be, you know, proprietary, and to be people of comfort and people of means. And you know, I think, of course, one of the things I like about the Tijani tradition is that, and this is others as well, that talk about this idea of a tariqat al-shukr, right? That it's a path of gratitude. In other words, you can be involved in the world as long as you keep your heart clean of anything else but God, then you don't have to deny your ability to seek blessing in the world through wealth and other means. So it's not as if, you know, I'm not saying that attaining certainty in this manner means you have to, you know, quit your job and start wandering the deserts like Al Ghazali did. But I think we should be aware of that example. That example is important, right? Because sometimes that the internal pain of, you know, tearing off the rust from our heart and wrenching it away from being orientated towards the dunya, and refocusing it on the light of God, and cringing at the shadows and the tarnishes that are revealed when the light of God shines on our hearts, right? That's painful, right? Taking stock of your own ego self, your own nafs, in its tricks, in its, you know, tantrums for the first time is painful, right? It should be. And so this is not it's not a comfortable process for anybody that's been through it, even if their external world seems to have not been affected at all by their attaining this knowledge of God. But this is a struggle, like the jihad against the self, meaning this is the jihad al-akbar, right? I mean, this is a very serious fight. When the Prophet ﷺ talks about this as a jihad, that means, right? What is a jihad? Jihad, you go to the field of battle, and there's only two ways out, right? Either you win or you die, right? And so when we face ourselves in this way, we have to have the same ambition and the same zeal and the same commitment that somebody who fights the enemy on the field of battle has, right? Because there's no way out. Once you fight that battle, you can no longer just sit down and have tea with that enemy. No, you have to either kill or be killed, right? And so that's what we're talking about. This type of sincerity and commitment to purifying the heart is something that, you know, does take a leap of faith. Is something that is not going to make you comfortable. But it is necessary, right? And I find that interesting, even with Shaykh Ahmad, because he was talking about, you know, yes, you can be involved in government, you can have your whatever job you want, you can have a lot of wealth, that's fine. And so some of the fuqaha, some of the jurists wrote to him and said, but this thing, this type of this tazkiyat an-nafs, this purification of the self, is very difficult. Like, is there an easy way? Is there an easier way out? And he says, no. Everybody has to go through this process of fighting the nafs.
Okay. Thank you for that response. We have a message from Nick Ozak. He sends salam and he says, thank you for this illuminating talk. His question is, how do the sages understand the sometimes analogous or similar religious experiences described by adherents of other faiths?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Assalamu alaikum, Nick. So yeah, and it's ones that I think Ibn Arabi spoke about it directly, but I would basically summarize by saying that all human beings are the same, right? We have different lata'if within our human conditions, right? Different subtle substances or spiritual centers, or however you want to describe it. In other words, we all have a nafs, right? We all have a heart. We all have a spirit. We all have aql. We all have intellect, right? And so any ascetic tradition that takes as its task the purification of the nafs, right, will have that heart purified to see certain things, right? And so they will have spiritual experiences, but it depends upon, this is where Al Ghazali's differentiation is important, right? It depends upon where that mirror is orientated, right? So that mirror could be oriented, there's a whole realm of unseen worlds, right? That heart could be orientated towards, right? They could be just seeing the jinn, for example, right? Or they have certain, they're able to read other people's thoughts, right? In that purified mirror of their heart. But the heart is purified, but it's not orientated towards God alone, right? So that would be the difference. I mean, I think there's an interesting narration in the Kitab al-Rimah of Shaykh Umar Futi, where he relates this, basically there's a Muslim who's on a boat with a Jewish person who's known to be this sort of ascetic, and the Jewish person says, well, that's you're a person of faith, I'm a person of faith, let's see whose faith is better. Let's see who can walk on the water, right? The Jewish person gets off the boat, starts walking on the water. So the Muslims like, well, I can't let Islam down, right? So he gets off the boat and he starts walking on the water too, right? But I think what's interesting here is that there's a specific recognition that even the karamat al-awliya, right, these kind of saintly miracles could be performed by a non-Muslim. In other words, they have a state where they've transcended their lower selves and are able to actualize certain aspects of their human potentiality in ways that we normally associate with Muslim awliya, right? But this is something that is well represented or well talked about. And for Ibn Arabi, in many texts, Ibn Arabi, he basically speaks about, when that station of spiritual purification happens, then the witnessing of tawhid is inevitable, right? In other words, it will happen. You will see the one. Now, you will see oneness in some way. Depending upon a person's vocabulary, they may not, or learned vocabulary, may not be able to call that Allah or the name for the transcendent being in their own language. They may call it nirvana or some other word. But this is something that they are going to see regardless, right? And he says the difference is, of course, is that the Muslim should be able to progress beyond that stage until they come to see the beauty of the Prophet Muhammad, right, who teaches them the correct adab, or the correct disposition, comportment in the divine presence.
We have a question from Brother Musaddiq. So he's basically talking about, you know, how you've highlighted the importance of this relationship between the creation and the creator. And you know, you talked about the verse where you said that worshipping Allah is actually to know Allah. And so what he's asking is, how can this be shared with other people who aren't familiar? How can people start to embark on this exploration of knowing Allah?
Mm-hmm. So the first, I guess Al Ghazali first is to read Al Ghazali. I think if you haven't, if people just don't have a familiarity of how these types of knowledge are supposed to be in dialogue or conversation with each other, right? Or just to get confirmation that this is an actual reality that has our tradition has centered on. And then, I think Al Ghazali and most of the Sufi tradition would first say, get to know yourself, right? And I'm reminded of a story where I was with with the Shaykh Tijani Sisi in Senegal, and we are in the car going to the mosque, and we see this non-Muslim American guy who's visiting the city, and he's kind of walking around, and so the Sheikh, he asked me, who is that person? And I said, it's a brother of my friend, and he came and he's visiting, and would you like me to come, bring him to introduce you? And he's silent for a moment, and he says, it's okay. He said, let him wander around until he looks inside of himself, and then let him come. Okay? And so I think this is what the Sufi tradition, how they might answer that, is to say, well, look, you need to know yourself, right, in order to know your need for God. Right? If you are, if you haven't really taken stock of yourself, and you're in effect worshiping yourself, then you're never going to be able to understand the one God, right? Because you're making yourself a God, essentially, right? And so Al Ghazali, he has methods for that as well, and he basically say, well, the best is to have a sheikh, right? The best way to get a stock of yourself and your need for God is to have a sheikh. He said there are other ways as well, right? He said you could have if you can't find a sheikh, then at least have a truthful friend, right? A friend that doesn't tell you what you want to hear, but tells you the truth about yourself, right? Surround yourself with those kinds of people. He said, but those friends are very rare. If you can't find a friend like that, then the best thing for you to do is to go out into the creation, and anytime you see anything bad, you see somebody acting jealously, you see somebody that's stingy, you should recognize that you're only seeing that because it's a reflection of yourself. So you should come back and blame yourself for anything bad you see in the creation, right? And that, he said, will give you an understanding of how bad your nafs is, right? And how you need to purify it and tame it to enter the divine presence.
Okay, we have two more questions. So we have a message from Vanessa. Thank you for this, Dr. Wright. I do have a question around receiving messages through dreams before becoming Muslim or even religious. How do the sages explain this? And I wonder how this comes to be without any sort of spiritual effort.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I also don't mean to suggest that the jihad of against the self is something that obligates one to obtain these types of experiences. At the same time, one can get experiences and knowledge without any work, right? In the end of the day, this is the bounty of God, and He gives it to whom He will, right? So this is not something that theologically speaking, even, right, our performance of a variety of different good deeds does not obligate God to give us any reward, right? At the same time, our being mired in the dunya, right, um, uh, does not prohibit God from taking us out in a single moment, right, and making us fly past the person who's been on the path for 40 years, right? So that's how I would explain it, simply by referring the very good question back to questioner, back to Allah Himself, because He's the ultimate doer, and He can do what He wants for any person, right? And this is also a good reminder for our own to keep humble, right? Because one of the reasons why you should treat all of the creation with a great deal of respect, whether you see them as a sinner or a disbeliever or not, is that God can change that person within the blink of an eye, right? And they can become light years ahead of you. So it's important to always and never disrespect anybody. Shaykh Hassan taught me this. He said, never disrespect anybody, because you could, is better to think somebody is a saint of God and find out on the day of judgment that they're not, than it is for you to think somebody is not a saint of God and find out on the day of judgment that they are, right? So this is how we should be careful with all of God's creatures.
And the last question, Fahad was asking, what was the title of the book you referred to towards the end of your talk? And are there any books that you would recommend that might help people to start to get an idea of some of the things that you talked about tonight?
Okay, so if you will allow me, I could just share my screen. Can I do that?
Yeah, I think that should be possible.
You've disabled my attendee screen sharing. It's no problem. So, so the book then is called Realizing Islam, the Tijaniya in North Africa in the 18th century Muslim world. And that book is available for free download. And if you go to the website tijani.org, you can find a link to download the book at that website.
What we'll do is we'll put it in the chat.
Sure, yeah. And I would also, I would also recommend, I think the works of Al Ghazali are, I think, fundamental for somebody kind of thinking about the spiritual path, trying to put this, situate, this type of knowledge within the broader conversation of the Islamic intellectual tradition. And so some of the sections, like the book I was referring to, of the Ihya al-Madin, the elaboration of the marvels of the heart, is something that is actually, it can be kind of dense. The book that I would really recommend for many of my students in my Sufism class is the Deliverance from Error, which is basically his autobiography, where he talks about the types of knowledge that he went through and his procedures for verifying knowledge, etc. So Munqidh min ad-Dalal, or Deliverance from Error. You can find the PDF online also.